Picture this. You're an elite athlete. You've spent your entire life training for this moment. Thousands of hours, years of sacrifice, family dinners missed, knees taped up, minds pushed past the breaking point, all so that one day you could stand on the biggest stage in world football and compete for the greatest trophy on the planet. And now, here you are. You've made it. The whole world is watching. And the single smartest thing you can do, the play that gives your country the best possible shot at going deep in this tournament, is to walk out onto that field and quietly, methodically, professionally try not to win. That is what was waiting for Algeria and Austria on Saturday night in Kansas City. Not a game, a trap, a mathematical riddle wrapped in 90 minutes of football. A situation so twisted, so structurally absurd, that sports philosophers could write dissertations about it and still not fully explain what these two teams were supposed to do. The reward for winning was punishment. The price of success was the worst possible draw in the knockout stage. And somewhere, in a hotel room they were not supposed to be staying in, an entire Iranian national team was watching the TV and praying that somebody, anybody, would score a goal. This is the story of the most complicated match of the 2026 World Cup group stage. The game nobody wanted to win. The game that almost repeated the single most shameful moment in football history. And the game that, against every rational expectation, ended up being one of the most dramatic 90-plus minutes of the entire tournament. Let's start with the architecture of the problem, because this situation did not fall out of the sky. It was built brick by the structure of FIFA's new 48-team World Cup format, a format that has been drawing criticism and controversy since the moment it was announced. When FIFA President Gianni Infantino unveiled the expansion from 32 to 48 teams, he sold it as inclusion, as growth, as football reaching more corners of the world. Critics saw it differently. They called it a vote-buying exercise, a way to bring more national football associations under FIFA's tent, locking up political support for Infantino's continued presidency of world football's governing body. More teams meant more votes. More votes meant more power. The beautiful game, once again, was secondary. And from the very beginning, analysts warned that the new format would create exactly the kind of perverse incentives that showed up in Kansas City. When 8 third-place teams qualify for the knockout stage, the mathematics of advancement can turn upside down in ways that actively punish ambition. But before we get to the logic, let's talk about the political atmosphere surrounding this tournament. Because the 2026 World Cup has been drenched in controversy from day one, and a lot of that controversy has nothing to do with what happens on the pitch. Infantino made headlines even before a single ball was kicked when he appeared at a so-called peace summit alongside President Donald Trump, wearing a red MAGA-style cap and accepting a handshake from a man whose administration was simultaneously denying entry visas to entire national delegations. Trump had already been handed the newly invented FIFA Peace Prize at the World Cup draw ceremony, a prize that critics noted had never existed before and appeared to have been created specifically for the occasion. FIFA's own rules mandate strict political neutrality. The image of the world football chief cozying up to a sitting head of state at a political rally struck a lot of people as, at the very minimum, a serious conflict of interest. At the very maximum, it looked like a governing body selling its soul for the right to host a tournament in the most powerful country on earth. And the politics did not stay outside the stadiums. The United States entered this World Cup while engaged in active military hostilities with Iran, marking the first time in the history of the competition that a host nation was at war with one of the competing countries. Iran's delegation members were denied visas. Their players had to base themselves in Mexico and fly into host cities on match days like athletes in exile, guests who were technically present but barely permitted to exist. Human rights organizations called on FIFA to expel Iran from the tournament entirely. FIFA declined. Meanwhile, the tension between the three co-hosts, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, was running so hot that diplomats were probably earning their salaries for the first time in years. Trump had been publicly joking about Canada becoming the 51st American state, had slapped tariffs on Mexican goods, and seemed to regard the co-hosting arrangement less as a celebration of shared continental culture and more as proof that his country was large enough to subsume its neighbors. It was not exactly the festive spirit of international brotherhood that World Cup hosts are supposed to project. Ticket prices added another layer of outrage. Seats for early group stage games were running into the thousands. Premium tickets for the final were initially listed at around $11,000 apiece. FIFA's dynamic pricing system meant that identical seats in identical sections were being sold for wildly different amounts depending purely on when you happened to check the website. Consumer protection attorneys, general from New York and New Jersey, opened formal investigations. The European Union received formal complaints. Some journalists started calling it less of a football tournament and more of an open-air money extraction experiment. And through all of it, Infantino kept smiling. Which brings us to Group J, which brings us to Spain. On Friday night, Spain finished off Uruguay 1-0 to win Group H. The European champions, the reigning kings of the continent, ranked third in the entire world entering the tournament, a team built on positional fluency, relentless pressing, technical perfection, and a collective intelligence that makes them look, on their best days, like 11 players sharing a single brain. They were waiting at the end of Group J's second-place slot like a wall you really, really did not want to run into. The bracket worked like this. Whoever finished second in Group J would face Spain in the round of 32, scheduled for July 2nd at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, right outside Los Angeles. That was the prize for winning the Algeria-Austria game. A date with La Roja, a front-row seat to your own elimination. Whoever finished third, on the other hand, could potentially escape as one of the 8 best third-place teams and find themselves matched up with Switzerland instead. Not Spain, Switzerland. The difference between those two paths was not subtle. Betting markets opened Austria's odds against Spain at more than 10-1. The punishment for winning was mathematically verifiable. Now drop Algeria and Austria into that framework and watch what happens. Austria entered the match in second place in the group, a point ahead of Algeria, but with a worse goal difference. Their manager, Ralf Rangnick, one of the most analytically sophisticated coaches in European football, was publicly wrestling with a situation that no tactical genius can fully solve. A win or a draw for Austria meant they stayed second, faced Spain, and were likely going home in the round of 32. A loss could drop them to third, slip them past the Switzerland bracket, and give them a genuine path deeper into the tournament. On pure cold mathematics, Rangnick's best possible outcome was to sit in the technical area and watch his team get beaten. For Algeria, it was more complicated, more dangerous actually. A draw was their golden ticket. It would push them into third, qualify them as a best-placed third team, let them avoid Spain entirely, and give Riyad Mahrez and company a puncher's chance against a far more manageable opponent. But a loss was not just bad, it was catastrophic. The statistical models gave Algeria less than 1% odds of advancing if they lost. A defeat meant going home. So Algeria could not simply decide to surrender the game and coast into comfortable irrelevance. They had to avoid losing while simultaneously not really trying to win. They had to play hard enough to not lose, but not so hard that they ended up winning. They had to thread a needle that was barely the width of a thread. And if that was not enough pressure, there was a third party watching this entire drama unfold with an interest that went way beyond casual observation. Iran had already completed their group stage. They had played their games, earned their points, and were now sitting in a hotel room at the mercy of other people's results. Their survival in the tournament came down to a very specific scenario. They did not need a particular team to win. They did not care which team finished second or third in Group J. They just needed someone to win, any win at all, because a draw, the same draw that was Algeria's dream scenario, was Iran's elimination scenario. One nation's ideal resolution was another nation's funeral. Algeria's perfectly played, cautious stalemate was, from Tehran's perspective, a national tragedy. If all of this feels like something that has happened before, that's because it has. 44 years ago, in the Spanish city of Gijón, the exact same two nations, Germany in Austria's place, performed one of the most publicly despised acts in the sport's history. The 1982 World Cup in Spain, Group 2, West Germany versus Austria. The situation was almost identically engineered, except in that case, the fix was less hidden. If West Germany won by exactly 1 or 2 goals, both teams would advance, and Algeria, who had already played their final group match and were watching from the sidelines, would be eliminated. West Germany scored in the 10th minute through Horst Hrubesch, and then, with the entire stadium watching in disbelief, both teams simply stopped playing football. For more than an hour, they passed the ball sideways, backwards in slow circles, in no particular direction, with no intention of scoring or conceding. Players walked between positions. The game moved at the pace of a Sunday morning kickabout. Spanish fans in the Estadio El Molinón were so disgusted they began whistling, then booing, then some of them literally set money on fire in the stands as a statement about what the match was worth. The Algerian bench watched from afar, slowly realizing they were being robbed in broad daylight with the entire watching world as a witness. It became known as the disgrace of Gijón, and remarkably, in one of the genuinely rare moments of FIFA, actually identifying a problem and implementing a structural solution, the governing body responded decisively. From the 1986 World Cup onwards, all final group stage matches have been played simultaneously. No more watching, another result, and adjusting. No more coordination. If you want to game the bracket, you now have to do it in the dark, without certainty, without knowing exactly what is happening a few hundred miles away. It closed the loophole. It made the Gijón scenario structurally much harder to repeat. But structurally harder is not the same as impossible. And as Thursday night in Kansas City approached, everyone who knew their football history was using the phrase "disgrace of Kansas City" before the match had even kicked off. Goal.com ran the headline directly. Pundits on 3 continents discussed whether we were about to witness football's ugly sequel 44 years later in Missouri. The simultaneous kickoff rule held. Both teams knew what they were doing. Both teams knew the incentives. And yet something remarkable happened. The game was not a disgrace. It was a war. Austria struck first. Marko Arnautovic, 37 years old and somehow still finding goals at the top level of international football, put his team ahead in the 28th minute. For a brief, disorienting moment, Austria was winning a game they statistically needed to lose. The incentive structure was being defied by a veteran striker who apparently did not get the memo about strategic passivity. Algeria hit back before halftime. Rafik Bulgali equalized, and suddenly the draw that everyone had predicted was back in place, which theoretically should have been the moment both teams put their feet up and coasted, which should have been the beginning of the slow, ugly, careful football that everyone feared. Instead, Marcel Sabitzer scored for Austria in the 55th minute, and the whole thing spiraled back into chaos. Algeria was behind again. If the match ended this way, Algeria were out. Iran were through. The entire complex mathematical structure had been blown apart by a midfielder who decided to actually try to score a goal. Riyad Mahrez, Algeria's captain, their most decorated and experienced player, a man who has lifted the Premier League title with Manchester City and the Africa Cup of Nations with his country, equalized again in the 60th minute. 3-2 became the scoreline. 3-2 also became the worst possible result for Iran. 3-2 meant Austria finished second, marched into Spain, and Algeria slipped through as one of the 8 best thirds. 3-2 meant Iran was out. There was a strange stretch around the 75th minute where the game slowed, where passes went sideways more than forward, where both managers seemed to momentarily accept the outcome and let the tempo drop. A ghost of Gijón, brief and flickering. At one point, Algeria strung together 109 consecutive passes. 109. Not as a tactical statement, not as a display of skill, as a way of making time pass without risk. The crowd recognized what it was. The whistles started. The chants grew louder. The stadium itself was demanding that someone do something real, and then Mahrez did something real. In the 93rd minute of the match, in the 3rd minute of added time, the former Leicester City and Manchester City winger received the ball in a dangerous position, made the kind of decision that separates good players from great ones, and drove a shot into the net. 3-2 had become 3-2 for Algeria. Algeria in front, Austria falling to third. Iran, who had been mathematically buried, suddenly and improbably alive. The Algerian supporters went into full hysteria. The Iranian bench erupted. A match that had supposedly settled into manageable equilibrium had just been shattered with 3 minutes left to play. And then, just as Iranian footballers were beginning to consider whether to hug each other, Sasa Kalidzic rose into the air from a Michael Gregorich delivery and headed the ball into the Algerian net. 96th minute. 3-3. Equal. Austria's manager said afterward that it was the kind of goal you could train for 1,000 times and never guarantee. A substitute, a towering forward coming off the bench at the death, doing the one thing nobody planned for. The final whistle blew almost immediately after. Both Austria and Algeria advanced. Austria finished second in Group J with 4 points. Algeria qualified as one of the 8 best third-place teams, also with 4 points. Argentina topped the group comfortably with 9 points from 3 wins. Jordan were eliminated, having lost all 3 matches. And Iran, who had been alive for approximately 120 seconds, were gone. The cruelest possible exit. Alive, then dead in the space of a stoppage-time header. Algeria's coach said afterward, "Football won tonight." In one sense, he was absolutely right. The simultaneous kickoff rule, the player's own competitive instincts, the crowd's noise, the sheer momentum of a high-stakes match, all of it combined to overwhelm the perverse mathematics that had pointed toward a quiet, arranged nothingness. Neither team was willing to publicly lie down and accept defeat. Their pride would not allow it. Whatever the bracket said, their instinct was to compete, and yet the structural problem that produced this situation has not gone away. It is baked into the format. The 48-team World Cup, with its 12 groups of 4 and its 8 advancing third-place teams, will keep generating these scenarios. Critics have been saying this since the expansion was announced. The format creates a larger safety net, which is exactly the point for the smaller football associations whose votes Infantino needs. More teams qualify, more countries feel included, more votes stay loyal. But the cost of that safety net is situations where teams can rationally calculate that winning hurts them more than losing. The BBC ran an analysis piece before the match under the headline about games that prove a 48-team tournament is flawed. Yahoo Sports asked whether the World Cup's magic was at risk. The central argument was always the same. When third-place teams advance in significant numbers, the penultimate group stage round loses the knife-edge tension that makes football's elimination format one of the most compelling competitive structures in sport. The Algeria-Austria game saved itself from becoming a symbol of that argument. But it saved itself through human nature and a competitive stubbornness, not through structural design. The incentive to play out a cowardly draw was still there. The disgrace of Kansas City still could have happened. It didn't, but only because the players decided they weren't going to let it. There is something worth pausing on in this broader picture. The 2026 World Cup is the largest in history, held across 3 countries, featuring 48 nations, running from June 11th through July 19th. It is, by almost any measure, the most commercially successful sporting event ever staged. FIFA projects revenues exceeding $13 billion from this single tournament. That number is worth saying again. $13 billion from a football tournament. For comparison, the entire gross domestic product of some competing nations is smaller than FIFA's projected tournament income. And yet the organization generating that $13 billion maintains its status as a nonprofit. It pays no federal taxes in the United States. It operates under a governance structure that its own members have repeatedly described as opaque, unaccountable, and structurally resistant to reform. The ticketing scandal, where attorneys general from 2 American states launched investigations into possible fraud and price manipulation, ran alongside this tournament, not as a scandal that paused the party, but as background noise that everyone was expected to tolerate in exchange for the spectacle. Infantino sat courtside with Trump at the draw. He accepted a peace prize that did not exist before he received it. He ran a tournament in a country that was actively at war with one of the competing nations and appeared entirely untroubled by this fact. And through all of it, the football played on, which is perhaps the point. The football always plays on. That is FIFA's greatest political asset. The tournament is so compelling, the sport so beautiful when it actually works, that criticism gets absorbed and forgotten by the 93rd minute drama of a substitute heading in an equalizer. Mahrez running toward the corner flag after his goal. The Austrian bench erupting after Kalajdzic's header. The Iranian players staring at a screen in disbelief at what those final 90 seconds had done to them. These moments are real. They matter. They represent exactly what the sport is capable of when human competitive instinct overrides structural logic. But the structural logic is still there. The incentives that nearly turned Kansas City into Gijón are still embedded in the format. And in the next edition of this tournament, or the one after that, or the one Infantino is already proposing at 64 teams, there will be another Algeria, another Austria, another set of nations staring at a bracket that whispers to them, you know what would actually be smarter? Losing. Austria now heads to SoFi Stadium in Inglewood on July 2nd to face Spain. A match the betting markets have priced as somewhere in the range of 10-1 against Austria. Ralf Rangnick's team earned this privilege by not quite losing in the way the math suggested they should. Spain awaits. La Roja, who went through their own group without losing a single match, without looking remotely threatened, a machine of collective precision that has been the dominant force in European football for the better part of 2 decades. Algeria, having survived their own mathematical tightrope walk, head to Vancouver to meet Switzerland. A game that is, by any rational measure, far more winnable than a date with the European champions. The reward for the draw, for Mahrez's goal, for Kalajdzic's header for 3-3 was a softer bracket. Both teams go through. Neither team got exactly what they wanted. Both teams get to play on. Iran packs up and goes home, eliminated by a header they could not control, from a match they could not influence, decided in a stadium they were not even in. That is the brutal poetry of tournament football. You can play every match perfectly. You can earn every point, and still someone else's stoppage time header ends your World Cup. An entire nation's dream closed by a substitute rising 6 feet in the air in Kansas City, Missouri, in the 96th minute of a match between Algeria and Austria. The game that nobody wanted to win ended up being one of the most memorable of the group stage. And if you are Iran, sitting in a hotel somewhere between Mexico City and Tehran, trying to make sense of what just happened to you, that distinction probably means very little right now. Football is the simplest game on earth. 2 teams, 90 minutes, score more than the other side. But at this World Cup, built by this FIFA, run in this political moment, broadcast into these $13 billion of commercial infrastructure, the game is anything but simple. The incentives are twisted. The format is broken in small but meaningful ways. The people in charge are chasing revenue with a focus that sometimes makes you forget they are supposed to be running a sport. And then a 37-year-old striker scores in the 28th minute, and a substitute heads in an equalizer in the 96th, and somehow, improbably, the football wins anyway. It usually does. That is the problem. That is the miracle. That is exactly what FIFA counts on.